Thank you everyone for joining. Professor Schumacher, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. My name is, or good evening if you're in India. My name is Edward Schumacher Matos. I am the director of the Fletcher School's Edward R. Murrow Center at Tufts University. We are very delighted to have today and to kick off a whole new series on U.S. public diplomacy and soft power. Two real leaders and thinkers on these issues. I want to keep introductions very short. You know who they are. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a Fletcher PhD, former Undersecretary General of the UN, and he's chairman of the Standing Committee in Parliament for Information Technology. James Murdoch knows India very well from his days running Star TV Asia, was former chairman CEO of Fox Entertainment, and James is now chairman CEO of Lupa Systems and has various activities in India, and of course everything to do with global entertainment and global now entrepreneurial and foundational work. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to James, who's presiding, and we'll host Dr. Tharoor. James.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Schumacher Matos, and everyone at in the Murrow Center and Fletcher community. It's a great honor to be asked to do this, and a real honor to be here with you, Dr. Tharoor, and to hopefully benefit and learn from the insight and wisdom you can bring to these topics. We're here to talk, obviously, about the views of the U.S. and I think importantly the U.S.-India relationship, in India, and in particular, really to listen to Dr. Tharoor's insights and inputs as this new program on soft power and American diplomacy kicks off for the Fletcher School. So while I'm sure we'll cover a lot of ground in the next hour, I'd like to start actually by just probing a little into that main topic and asking Dr. Tharoor about views of the U.S.-India relationship, and perhaps at a couple of different levels: views in government in India, in sort of the policy community generally, as well as in industry and amongst the population. Perhaps you could sort of enlighten us a little bit of where you see, after the beginning of a second Modi administration and the end of the first Trump administration, where you see the state of affairs in the relationship between these two democracies and how things stand.
Thank you, James. I'm sorry to say that a slightly unstable internet connection meant I lost the first half of your remarks, but I got your question. How do things stand between the two countries? Right. And say, if I don't seem to have addressed something you began saying, do repeat it, because I couldn't hear it clearly. But just to say that, that in many ways, the relationship is so much better because it's transcended the limitations that had besieged it during the Cold War. You had this extraordinary process in which a succession of administrations took it from an absolute nadir, when after the Indian nuclear explosion in 1998, the US had even imposed sanctions on relations with India. And from there, President Clinton's visit towards the end of his term, George Bush making India into an exception to many of the existing American policies in the nuclear domain, President Obama and his closeness to Singh, all of this has been continued in many ways with President Trump and Mr. Modi. So I would argue that you're looking at a relationship now that seems to have acquired a tremendous amount of stability that is certainly underpinned by elements that have become more significant over time, like the number and the influence of the Indian American community in the American political process. This is a community that is active politically, arguably out of proportion to its numbers. You have had already two Indian American governors. You've had half a dozen Indian American congressmen and women, and now you have an Indian American or half Indian American vice presidential candidate. So there's a tremendous visibility to the Indian American community that I think makes it impossible for their interests in their homeland to be completely ignored by politicians. All of this, I think, has placed things on a solid footing that is relatively unaffected by the different positions of different administrations. But still, I would mention a couple of caveats. I think with Trump, the relationship has become very much more transactional than with previous American administrations. There used to be an explicit line in the George Bush days that exceptions would have to be made for India because the relationship had to come a long way from the days of the Cold War. And so, for example, India's reluctance to give in, as it were, to the American desire for, shall we say, joining American-led partnerships vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis other parts of the world, that was allowed, as it were. The fact that India continued to be a major arms client of Russia was not seen as an impediment. All of these were done because the US adopted a position that building India up and encouraging its rise and its strength, economic as well as military, was in America's interest, irrespective of whether India was giving America everything it wanted. I think that's less true under Trump. Trump has a much more transactional view of these things. It's what have you done for me lately? When are you buying my arms? Why are you putting tariffs on my Harley Davidsons? You've got all of these things, and even a little mini trade war between India and the US took place, and Trump took India off the generalized system of preferences, which has been a costly business for Indian exporters, I beg your pardon, Indian importers of American goods. So all of these things, as well as Indian exporters to America. So all of these things suggest that things are a little tougher under Trump than they were under the last three administrations since 1998. And then if you look at the Modi side of things, there is a problem in that whereas the old Indian narrative of this thriving, plucky, liberal democracy with a free market economy, bravely holding its own, overcoming poverty, facing up to a giant, nuclear armed giant to the north in China, and an Islamist state encouraging terrorism against it, also nuclear armed to the west in Pakistan. All of this had given India a certain halo in the Western world and in the US. But Mr. Modi's much more assertively Hindutva policies and politics at home, his assertiveness vis-a-vis the minorities in India, whether Muslim or Christian, and his belligerence, for example, on stripping Kashmir of its autonomy, all of this have won him a rather negative press in the Western world and in America. And so many American liberals, including some of Indian American heritage, have become much more critical of the government of India under Mr. Modi than they would have been of any previous Indian government in the preceding couple of decades. So you've got an unusual shift, a minor shift still in terms of that fundamental approach I described to you, but I think a minor shift vis-a-vis both administrations, which we can't entirely ignore.
Yes, I think, I mean, much has been made about, as you put it, this more sort of transactional relationship or approach from both President Trump as well as Prime Minister Modi. But also much has been made about the personal warmth and relationship between these two largely populist leaders. I'm curious, when you think about moving the relationship from that transactional relationship which goes up and down, even though the overall trajectory, as you point out, has been positive, increased trade, particularly vis-a-vis China and India versus US and China, increased military sales, increased cooperation on technology and other issues. How do you think a potential new administration that we'll find out about at some point in the next few months, a potential new administration or second Trump administration should be approaching moving the US-India relationship to a more strategic relationship? Because all of those conditions continue to exist. The situation in Pakistan, the situation in China, even more inflamed. What are the signals that a US administration should be sending? And what are the things that they should be prioritizing, working on in the context of a more strategic relationship going forward?
Right. Well, I mean, I think the answer is slightly different depending on who wins your election, because it seems to me that that if you're looking at a Biden administration, you will be on much more familiar ground, if you like. I mean, I imagine, for example, a US much more enjoying faith in a rule-based, open, democratic world order, interested in India's partnership in things like the management of the global economy through the G20, anxious to maintain a system of free trade and globalization, all of the things that have been undermined in many ways by Mr. Trump and his administration. So I do think that would be a significant difference. I mean, under Biden, you will see India and the US, for example, doing much more to act together to preserve the global commons, the environment, which Mr. Trump poo-poos, Mr. Biden does not, the high seas, human trafficking, outer space, cyberspace. All of these are areas in which the two democracies, one the world's richest, the other still emerging from poverty, have different approaches, but which would, I think, find a greater meeting ground under a Biden-led Democratic administration, from what I know of the kind of people around him, than perhaps under a continuing Trump administration, which is decidedly much more America first, much less interested in these global themes, much less convinced, for example, about things like green energy technologies or sharing them with India or combating cybercrime, or, you know, the kinds of things you can see sort of goody two-shoes Biden and the Democrats happily working with India on. Trump is going to be much more hard-nosed. Conversely, however, if India decides to react to Chinese misbehavior on its borders by embracing the American-led strategic relationship in the Indo-Pacific much more tightly, then you could see the Trump administration or a successor administration of the same stamp really reciprocating. Because I think the US, and you've heard this in the comments of people like the Deputy Secretary of State, Stephen Biegun, the Secretary of State himself, Mr. Pompeo, Mike Pompeo, you've heard some very clear language that they regret their having helped build up China, that they want to see China curbed and contained, and they see India, Japan, Australia as natural partners, even allies in all of this. Mr. Biegun perhaps slightly carelessly used the word Asian NATO, which normally would have created a major allergic reaction in India because of the history of India's experience with the US during the Cold War, when Pakistan was a member of CETO and India was not. But anyway, let's not go into details and terminology right now. Either way, I think you're going to see the US-India relationship being tremendously important for both countries' strategy in the region. For India, I think it's more and more realizing that it cannot merely continue with business as usual in the neighborhood. The Chinese have clearly demonstrated with the activities on the border that they have been pursuing a strategy of taking what they can from the Indians while the Indians aren't looking, issuing a few conciliatory noises, taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and gradually shifting the line of actual control along the border to what the Chinese want, all the while saying to the Indians, oh, let's leave this border for future generations to settle. By the time that future generation is born and grows up, the Chinese will have got the line where they want it, the way they're going. And India has to really wake up and start saying, we have to stop this process. So I think all of these things will mean that India will be looking to a closer partnership with the US. It's almost certainly going to stop short of anything that can be described as an alliance, because India still has a post-colonial allergy to alliances. You know, we had 200 years of the British deciding things for us, including our place in the world. Very clearly, we're going to want to decide these things for ourselves, and we wouldn't want to lose our autonomy or our freedom to an ally. But I think I can see much more partnership within the quadrilateral alliance we mentioned, Australia, Japan, India, and the US, as well as a wider dialogue with other countries in Asia that share some of the worries of India and the US about China. Countries like Vietnam, Singapore, Indonesia, perhaps. There are many countries that are looking at China and saying, hey, if we don't stop them now, they're going to be sitting on us tomorrow. And I think that's the kind of thinking that India in the past would have stayed away from, but I think today is much more receptive to.
Yes, it seems certainly that the common interests or common issues in the region, but also globally with respect to thinking about how to deal with China and thinking about what the right posture there inevitably draws India and the US as the two most dynamic democracies in the world closer together. I was going to ask you about alignment and non-alignment, et cetera. Obviously, there's a lot of caution around that, but clearly this is an issue where common ground might be found. I wanted to probe a little bit into what you were saying earlier. There was a lot in that answer about the Indian American diaspora, or the Indian diaspora in America, and their attitudes. You mentioned perhaps more negativity towards the Modi government, perhaps as well as, and looking at voting patterns with its large focus on things like immigration and things like that in the US, very much leaning Democratic in terms of how the Indian American population has been voting. How do you see a Democratic administration, if there is one, kind of approaching this relationship with respect to things like human rights, putting things on the table that maybe haven't been on the table for many, many years? And is that something that is going to maybe be a counterfactor against closer alliance? And I'm curious what sort of Indian government and policymaking attitudes are towards, a Democratic administration influenced by the Indian American diaspora, as well as their own general tendency to focus on more of those sorts of issues. How do you see that dynamic developing, particularly with a number of years left of a Modi government with a strong majority?
Well, I think it will depend to a great extent, James, on how the American administration, whether Democrat or Republican, analyzes the level and degree of the threats and challenges faced by India in its neighborhood, which includes China. We have, after all, the world's longest land boundary with China, and we have, of course, Pakistan on the other side. If the US sees these threats and challenges as being of such transcendent importance for America's own strategy in Asia, that it does not want to undermine India, it will downplay its human rights concerns, whether it's a Democratic administration or not. I would agree with your implicit assumption that a Democratic administration is more likely to want to raise issues of human rights. We've actually seen Kamala Harris and the Democratic Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal both sticking their necks out in talking about their disappointment with the Narendra Modi government in India on human rights issues. So it wouldn't surprise me to see them being raised, but equally, I can see an American administration seeing, the center of gravity in the world has moved away from the Atlantic to Asia. We have to examine our own interest in relation to the incontestable rise of China, and whether we have therefore a vested interest in supporting the counterbalancing growth and prowess of India. And if we think we have that, then are we going to let, for example, what's happening in Kashmir, or the way in which India is treating its Muslim minority, or even its Christian minority for that matter, to actually undermine the most credible, viable partner we could have to resist or constrain Chinese adventurism? Perhaps not. Perhaps what they might do instead is that a President Biden would say to his vice president or to Congresswoman Jayapal or others, listen, I will tell Mr. Modi privately this is a problem for us, but I don't want to make this an issue on the table publicly because we have bigger fish to fry with the Indians. I mean, that sort of thing could happen. Mr. Trump, of course, doesn't really care. And Mr. Trump is arguably more Islamophobic than any Indian leader, Mr. Modi included, and therefore, he would not worry at all about the way in which Mr. Modi is treating Indian Muslims or Kashmiris. But of course, he would worry if Mr. Modi was misbehaving with the Christians. And that's something which is an influential minority in the US. I mean, an Indian minority in terms of its influence in the US that Mr. Modi can't afford to alienate either. So obviously, I'm from the opposition in India, and we have historically been proud of our inclusive and open policy to all our population. We embrace and defend and protect our minorities, and therefore for us this is an important issue. For Mr. Modi, he has there's a different, shall we say, a more Hindu-centric view of the national interest domestically. And I think that the US will eventually analyze this, not in terms, it seems to me, of India's domestic developments alone, but in terms of the stakes vis-a-vis belligerent China. Now, meanwhile, if China changes, if we see once again the China of the peaceful rise that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, was so enamored of, then all bets are off for India. I mean, if China is once again friendly, non-belligerent, they stop going on about their 9-dash line, and they stop threatening their neighbors, and they accept more democracy and freedom in Hong Kong and Taiwan, et cetera, and they don't mistreat their Uyghur minority so much, and so on, America might well be willing to say, well, this is a China we can live and work with, and then feel freer to wrap India on the knuckles over human rights. But I think as long as China is the China we've seen for the last 6 or 9 months, I have a feeling that any American administration will tread lightly on India on human rights, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican administration, because their principal interest will be in shoring up India against China.
Yeah, I might say that trend line is longer than 6 or 9 months, but that's not for argument here.
But you know, it's got so much worse in 6 or 9 months, James. I mean, yes. you know the region extremely well, and so I don't need to repeat this to you. But if you look at what the Chinese have been up to in these 6 or 9 months, the sort of wolf warrior diplomacy, it's quite astonishing. The tightening of the grip over Hong Kong, ending the former colony's semi-autonomous status, increasing maritime patrols near the Senkaku Islands of Japan, all over the East China Sea, sending vessels off the coast of Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, redoubling their extensive claims based on the preposterous 9-dash line in the South China Sea, conducting aerial reconnaissance near Taiwan, unleashing trade sanctions and economic pressure on Australia, imposing 80% tariffs on Australian barley, and conducting cyber attacks against Australia's government servers, deploying military force in their border dispute with Bhutan. Of course, shoving more and more Muslim Uyghurs into the concentration camps. All of these things, and of course, their rhetoric and their criticism of liberal democracies in general and Western countries in particular. This is a resurgent, brazen China that we've only seen since about March. I mean, they were initially very apologetic about having been the country that unleashed COVID on the world, and then they suddenly decided to turn around and say, the heck with this, we will be belligerent. And that's how they've been, haven't they?
I think it's certain that we can consider a context where that sort of behavior continues, and therefore, to your point before, you know, if you have this very convenient sudden shift, then all bets are off with respect to the US-India alliance or relationship. But I think the overall context today is reasonably clear with respect to that. I'm curious, when you think about attitudes towards the U.S. and attitudes towards these shifting potential alliances or shifting loyalties, how you see trade coming into that, in particular with respect to the real focus in India on the sort of made in India, made at home, you know, independent, self-reliant manufacturing base, particularly with respect to technology. You know, a lot of countries worry about things like, you know, Chinese technology, et cetera. But even more broadly than that, this is a bigger push around homegrown capability, homegrown companies, et cetera, even in the context of larger foreign direct investment of a minority nature into large companies like the geo platforms or et cetera. How do you see Indian trade policy and domestic policy, particularly I'm curious around technology, sort of evolving to, and how is that going to impact relationships both, well, essentially with the West, with the US and with Europe as well?
Well, that's a very good question, James, because I would argue that, in fact, just as India and the US have no geopolitical problems with each other, they do have some severe economic and trade issues. And it's quite troubling that Mr. Modi's self-reliance emphasis has come at a time when he really does need a better relationship with the US, when Washington still hasn't lifted all the export controls and restrictions on sharing high technology with India, which you know, the previous Indian administration had been working on getting the US to lift. I mean, the fact is that when Mr. Trump came in and acting as if he's suspicious of the very economic policies that every one of his predecessors had traditionally advocated, free markets, trade, immigration, technological change, and so on, Indians were actually initially worrying that as the world was increasingly opening up, America might be closing down. But now we've got a situation where India has reacted to what happened with the pandemic by saying that, listen, we've suddenly realized that we can't afford to be dependent on global supply chains. Look how the Chinese, for example, suddenly cut off medical supplies to us. We have been thriving on outsourcing to the US's through our IT-enabled services sector, but the US is cutting back on that. The US wants jobs to come back to America instead of sending them off to Bangalore or Shanghai for that matter. There's also this concern, absolutely, that in the US under Trump, you've seen American states, for example, taking decisions not to outsource major government contracts to India. There've been punitive visa fees imposed by the US Congress and white-collar Indian experts working for Indian technology providers. So, America wants to sell us goods. We want to sell America services. And if the US under Trump is going to get tough and restrictive on our ability to send you what we are able to send you, then India will feel all the more willing to start curbing how much you're willing to sell us. And this is potentially a genuine wrinkle, or more than a wrinkle, maybe a roadblock in the relationship between the two countries. You know that India has become a bit protectionist under Mr. Modi. You have seen, for example, the way in which it backed off from the regional comprehensive economic partnership in Asia out of sheer fear, frankly, that its industries would not be able to resist competition from some of the economies in that partnership, particularly China, but also, for example, on dairy with New Zealand, on palm oil with Malaysia, and different areas with different sorts of members of RCEP. And so India was saying, hey, we aren't ready to trade the level playing field. We still need help. Whereas Mr. Trump's attitude is, why should India need help? It's not a developing country anymore. In fact, the US administration took India off the list of developing countries. So I think we're looking at a very important period of uncertainty on trade policy. And I think it will be uncertainty on both sides, James. I think it's uncertainty on the Indian side because of this increasing emphasis on protectionism and self-reliance. And it's uncertainty on the US side because of Mr. Trump's desire and anxiety to bring more jobs back home and win votes on the basis that he has done so. And I think clearly you're going to see an India America minor quarrel, if not a major one, on the trade issue in the next year or two.
And I think it's probably safe to assume, or rather, it would be, I think you can assume that regardless of a new administration, either a Biden administration or a continued Trump administration, that emphasis on domestic economic development is going to continue. And I don't see that, I don't see that we will shift all the way back to a kind of embrace of multilateralism and embrace of organizations like the G20 or G7 or whichever. We continue to be in an environment, that's been described as kind of every nation for itself, particularly post-pandemic. It feels like that's probably where we are as this economic pain and joblessness sort of continues. And that kind of leads to my next question, and then I think we're going to open this up to the audience to take some questions, if that's okay, which is when you look at the scarce opportunities potentially to really embrace multilateral institutions because of this dynamic you've been talking about, what are the things that the U.S. and India, and what are India's sort of from a standpoint of self-interest as well? What are the things that should be prioritized in your view in this relationship with respect to then engaging with international and multilateral institutions, be it the G20, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so the COP process, and so on and so forth? When you think about, security issues, climate issues, trade issues, the number or military issues in terms of defense technology, how would you think India will be prioritizing that? And then what are the opportunities for the US-India relationship to move forward, either using those international institutions or finding partnerships bilaterally where at least they can agree on that thing, even if we're going to have a dust up on these other things that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think that you're looking at an India at this time in which there are very serious problems. I don't know if you're all aware that we've our GDP is estimated to have shrunk by as much as 29% in the first quarter of the current fiscal year. We have serious issues. Some of our trade retaliation against China because of the border conflict has meant that we have actually not only found ourselves unable to compensate in terms of our dependence on China for our non-consumption economy. What's more is that many of our own imports from China, manufacturing inputs, industrial equipment, components, even some technological know-how came from China. So we're going to have some real problems. And of course, in some ways, it's a golden opportunity for a generous America to turn around to India and say, hey guys, we will give you everything you're losing out on by being tough on China. We want to be tough on China too, and we'd like to help you overcome it. But that does mean you need to open up certain things. The question is whether Mr. Modi and his foreign trade bureaucracy has the vision, the imagination, the courage to open up credibly to the Western world. At this stage, it's very difficult to suggest that they do, because as you rightly implied, James, the pandemic has convinced people that you really need to rely much more on yourselves, because dependence on foreign countries, dependence on supply chains from elsewhere, dependence on production facilities in other countries is bad news when something like a pandemic strikes and borders are thrown up and travel restrictions and trade restrictions and so on come in. I mean, for example, I remember reading how the US discovered suddenly overnight that 100% of your ibuprofen, that's the stuff that goes into making Advil, comes from China. And if China's lockdown and shutdown after Wuhan had continued more than it did, nobody in America would have been able to take an ibuprofen headache pill. You know, that's the kind of dependence that the globalized world economy had created. And clearly many people in many countries have said, this is not good anymore, we can't do this. But at the same time, you know, you asked what are India's priorities? I mean, I've always argued that India's fundamental priority in foreign policy, in managing all its world relationships, has got to be to essentially see our place in the world as a means of facilitating our own domestic transformation. I mean, we need to wield a foreign policy that enables and facilitates our country's growth and development, our society. We have to benefit through our engagement with the world while promoting our own national values within our own society. And therefore, the India-US partnership is what you and I have been talking about, must work for a global environment that supports our internal priorities, ours as well as yours, that facilitates our energy security, our food security, our environmental future. And so while we are trying to make our national transformation a success story, you, I think, I would argue, have a stake in an India that is prosperous, an India that is successful, because such an India is a far more worthwhile partner to have in a world in which, frankly, China is still on the rise and is rather brazen and belligerent about its rise. And that's why it seems to me the US needs to take itself a strategic look at India and say, listen, we will need to help India. We'll need to make some allowances for it. We'll need to help it with its economic growth. We'll need to help it become more resourceful, more strong. We'll need to help it reduce its dependence on a country like China, because otherwise, when China overtakes the US in GDP terms, as you know, it's scheduled to do in just over a decade's time, then the US will find itself without a useful countervailing force in this part of the world if it doesn't do that. So I think the onus is on both sides. I think you certainly need more imagination from our side, from the Indian government side, and much more flexibility and willingness, which the Modi government has shown in geopolitics, all the logistics supports agreements, all the geopolitical dialogue with the US has been strong, but you need to see that on the trade side as well. And that's where the US may have to give a little more than the Trump administration has so far been willing to give.
Yes, I think it's an interesting point you make, and I've often thought that and argued that in the absence, you know, if we're convinced that we will not be living in a unipolar world with America as a lone superpower, then it's crucial for everyone, for Asia to be multipolar. And I think is in everyone's interests to have the strongest and to have the largest democracies in the world thrive and succeed. in the face of what continues to be an ideological, argument on a global basis between totalitarianism and liberalism, and that's a crucial, I think, common interest that hopefully all sides can focus on, and like you say, show the flexibility on some other issues to make sure that that larger goal is not compromised. I think we're due to take a couple of questions from the audience. So, and if people have questions, they can put them in the chat box. And our Chief Mittal, who is just joined by video over there, is going to read out some of those questions or possibly call on some of the askers to do it. So we'll move to that phase because I know that Dr. Tharoor has a hard stop with the schedule this evening in New Delhi. So Archish?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor and James. It was a really insightful discussion. I enjoyed it very much. So question from one of our audience members, Ashutosh Patil, which resonates with me quite a lot as well. How will the outcome of the US presidential elections impact the immigration policy vis-a-vis Indian tech workers as well as the student community? And just so you know, we have over 100 students join in right now, not just from Fletcher, but around the world. So it's an important question.
Well, I think it's a very, very serious question that only Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden can answer, because Mr. Trump has not been particularly friendly. And some of the restrictions imposed by his administration on H-1B visas, for example, of course, a serious concern. I mentioned this in part in answering an earlier question from James Murdoch, that there have been a real set of constraints on Indian techies being able to come in and work. The restrictions on their spouses being able to work has also been a dampener. Contracts have been withdrawn from Indian companies in the tech space by state governments in the US and others. So you're seeing a certain retrenchment in this regard, which obviously doesn't augur terribly well for those Indian techies who want to keep their foot in both camps, work for an Indian tech company, work in the US providing services, or for the US providing services. I believe that Mr. Biden and the Democrats are a little more open, a little more understanding about this. But, the old cliche about the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We will have to see exactly how each administration behaves. I don't think there's much to be encouraged about in this domain in Trump administration policy, both on immigration in general and specifically on things like tech visas, which is what the thrust of your question was. So clearly, for Indian techies, they would probably breathe a bit easier with a Democratic administration, which tends to have a more liberal and welcoming attitude to immigrants generally, and particularly to specialized workers from foreign countries, foreign students. As you know, the American administration under Mr. Trump has placed some very severe restrictions on foreign students, including visas to students coming into campuses where courses are now online, and the duration of how long they can stay on student visas has also been curbed by the Trump administration. The Democrats have really had a very different approach on that. So from that point of view, I think the election result will make a very big difference in deciding what the answer will be.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. So we have another question from Ashwin. He says, US and India are partnering in Quad and many such multilateral engagements. And many agreements, including the nuclear deal, have been signed between US and India. Do you see more such agreements and engagements coming forward between both the countries? And also, if you have any recommendations on how both the countries, US and India, should work together in the post-COVID world?
Sure. I mean, I think that very clearly India has an interest in a good relationship with the US, and that's been clear for some time now, I would say for 20 years. But perhaps both sides, both the US and India, have been somewhat guilty in judging the relationship through a checklist of their own expectations. So India says, we want Washington to lift export controls, restrictions on sharing high technology, give us more green technology, stop being so tough with us on certain trade issues, et cetera, et cetera. India has a wish list, and the US too has a wish list. And so the US has people in Washington, and I must say under both administrations, who have said, what is New Delhi expect in terms of a strategic relationship with the US? How much is it willing to give? Is it going to be remaining obsessed with its own strategic autonomy? Will it accept some responsibilities in sharing the world in which it wishes to thrive? Will they actually work with Washington without being prickly about preserving their sense of not being in an alliance, etc., etc. So all of these things, these two sort of mismatches have been there. They've been a permanent feature almost of the Indo-US relationship. Different priorities on terrorism, mismatched threat perceptions, incompatible views on Pakistan as a credible partner for peace, and of course the trade relationship that James and I spoke about at some length, including a rather bitter duel between the two countries on the Doha round under the WTO. So all of these things, plus compounded by some issues of style, American insensitivity on the one hand, Indian preachiness on the other, which have tended to sometimes rub diplomats in each country the wrong way. But I would argue, as I said earlier, there is no real clash of interests. On no issue of vital national interest to either country is the other country arraigned on the wrong side. So the answer will depend a lot on the external situation, how that changes. Globally, we've been entering a period of transition from an era of US dominance, a rather short-lived era, some would say less than 20 years from the end of the Cold War to the recession of 2008, to a rise of China into a situation initially of genuinely a capacity to resist and balance the US, and perhaps tomorrow to be even stronger than the US. And so the US is coming to terms with the world where the center of gravity is moved away from the US, from the Atlantic, from the West. And India is suddenly facing this rather tough giant right across its border. We could afford the luxury of being non-aligned in a Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, because neither was our neighbor, both were sufficiently safely far away. Can you be non-aligned when one of the belligerent powers, and particularly the more belligerent power, is sort of pushing and kicking dust in your face, or snow in your face, to be more geographically accurate, across your own border? So this is the kind of thing that I think is going to be very important. The external environment, and in particular the relationship with China, America's policies vis-a-vis China and Pakistan, all of these things are going to be determining where India ends up with. I think that India is much more prepared to embrace the US as a close partner than it's ever been.
Okay, Dr. Tharoor, thank you so much. Just expanding on what you just answered, there's a question from a scholar from Kashmir University, Tahir Bhatt, and the question is, since India is becoming more illiberal and is losing soft power, do you think America will trust and align itself with the majority in India?
Well, Tahir, I answered that question earlier because, as you know, as an opposition MP, I do believe that this government is becoming more illiberal. I'm not sure that India is, but certainly the elected government of India is more illiberal than any of its predecessors were, including its BJP predecessor, Mr. Vajpayee, who talked famously about Kashmiriyat and Insaniyat, as you may remember. So certainly I have absolutely no doubt that it will be a factor. But as I mentioned when this question came up between James Murdoch and myself, the extent to which it will be a factor will depend on the extent to which the US prioritizes what it sees or what it may or may not see as a major Chinese threat, and the importance of overlooking India's illiberality and its loss of soft power in the interest of shoring up a potential countervailing force or a balancing force vis-a-vis China. I mean, the entire question, and this is the known unknown, if I can borrow from Mr. Rumsfeld, we know that what we don't know is what's the world going to be like after the American elections are over and you have a new president or a re-elected president, and how the Chinese threat will loom in the geostrategic perspective of that US administration. Because they may be prepared to forgive, as we've seen in the past, right? Throughout human rights became an issue in American foreign policy under Jimmy Carter, who was elected in 1976. So we're talking about 44 years that the concept has been around as an element of foreign policy. And yet during that period, there have been many situations, especially during the Cold War, where the US overlooked human rights issues and liberal democracy's absence in indispensable partners because it felt those partners were crucial in its more significant contest with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. If you get to a point where the Americans see the Chinese as being such a negative force that they will overlook the illiberality of a Narendra Modi administration in order to encourage India to resist China, then all bets are off. You see, I mean, we in the domestic space in India are continuing the battle for India's liberal democracy. But it may or may not be terribly important to America if they see the Chinese threat as significantly as they saw their geostrategic competition with Russia.
And I think, if I may add, Dr. Tharoor, or just, I think there's a, obviously these are questions of degrees and of relative priorities. In a large democracy, as posited in the question, potentially moving towards majoritarianism, nonetheless, that's a different country than a totalitarian state. It has sort of antithetical kind of views with respect to individual freedoms and rights, et cetera. So a lot will depend as well on the degree of how it's perceived and what are the issues that really arise. So I think Dr. Tharoor pointed out very well, to the extent of religious intolerance with respect to the Indian Christian minority, that's obviously going to be a very different set of issues than, for example, religious intolerance with respect to Islam. And that's not, I wouldn't advocate any of that, but I'm saying that's the sort of reality, I think, in terms of what the politics look like. And a focus on human rights in American foreign policy is not, certainly not the domain of one party or another. You can certainly see, particularly with religious intolerance, I mean, George W. Bush made that a priority with Chinese relations. Although I think it's probably right that a less transactional US administration will prioritize some level of human rights issues in a way that President Trump certainly has not. I think we have time.
I agree with everything you said there.
I think we have time probably for one or two more questions, Ashish, just being mindful of Dr. Tharoor's schedule. So do you have more from the audience?
Absolutely, yes. So there's another, yeah, there's actually a lot more in the chat box. So there's a question that just came on. Earlier in the escalation episode, President Trump offered to mediate between India and Pakistan regarding the Kashmir issue. If the strategic partnership between India and US really does go to the next level, do you think there's going to be a different approach taken to this dispute?
Well, President Trump has had a habit of offering to mediate in all sorts of places that no one has asked him to mediate in. So I frankly wouldn't take that seriously. And it didn't seem as if he had been well briefed or well scripted on this, because India's had a real allergy to mediation, especially vis-a-vis Pakistan, because as you know, we actually speak each other's language in every sense of the term and have no difficulty understanding it. And from our point of view, the issues with Pakistan are very clear. And also the stakes are very clear in that there's some very fundamental non-negotiable issues, perhaps arguably for both countries, that no mediator will be able to bridge. So I don't see that, frankly. Even if Mr. Trump is re-elected and he comes back and says, let me mediate between you and Pakistan, I think India will very politely kiss him off on that one. Because, we can talk to the Pakistanis in certain circumstances and in certain, shall we say, in certain terms which at the moment Pakistan does not seem prepared to oblige India on. China is a much bigger challenge for both countries. I mean, it was the US that first spoke of decoupling from China, but many of its allies and partners have taken steps. Japan, for example, has come up with a fund of a few billion, I think $250 billion for those Japanese companies who are prepared to leave China, pull out of China. I mean, this sort of stuff is happening. And so I think that a lot of what's happening in the world in relation to countries' desire to undo their prior dependence on China, that's going to set the tone for a lot of other relationships. And you're going to see, for example, that in the next 6 months or so, when a new administration in Washington takes stock of its options, that in some ways the newfound belligerence of China that I anatomized in an earlier answer to James Murdoch, that belligerence will turn out to have been disastrously timed by the Chinese, because they have really managed to give fodder for their most severe critics in both parties at a time when strategic decisions are going to be made by a new administration. So that veers slightly off from your question, but I think you see where I'm coming to. That what options India has vis-a-vis the US and so on will also depend on how the US examines its options. For example, President Trump said he'd convene an expanded gathering of the G7 leaders in Washington to include Australia, South Korea, and India at the meeting, right? What did Joe Biden say? He said that he wants to have a global democracy summit in his first few months in office if elected. So India, as the world's largest democracy, is clearly expected to feature in a starring role at either event. So you either have the G7 being expanded by Mr. Trump into something like a group of 10 democracies, or you have Mr. Biden talking about a maybe larger than 10 democracies summit. Either way, India suddenly gets a new platform in its relationship with the US. But let's not pretend this is merely because of India's historic democracy. It's because of the perception in Washington that you now have to shore up the ramparts against an increasingly belligerent, hostile, and worrying China. So this is why I keep saying, let's not look at the relationship only in terms of considerations in both countries. The external environment, and that mostly means China, is going to be a very important factor in delimiting the choices and options for both the US and India in their relationship.
I'm Archish, if I may, I'm curious, Dr. Tharoor, of your views on a similar, I guess, a related question, and some of the themes in the chat box questions touch on this. But when you mentioned earlier the offer of the Trump administration to mediate between India and Pakistan, which is, as you said, would be politely defined. That said, when tensions escalate with Pakistan, for example, with downing of the Indian Air Force jet recently, it was clearly a multi-party effort to de-escalate that situation. Do you see, with continuing or escalating tensions sort of to the I guess just to the northeast and on the border and the questions around the line of control with China, as long as that situation continuing, it being in everyone's interest, US, Pakistan, India, et cetera, to keep everything calm on the Pakistani border? Is that, and how do you see that dynamic playing out? And what would happen if that's not possible?
Okay, first of all, it was rather well done because it was done quietly. If you look back on the newspaper and media coverage of that incident within India and Pakistan, the US did its work very quietly behind the scenes with the Pakistanis. There were no big headlines. Mr. Trump wasn't there all over trying to take credit. It was done subtly, quietly, and that kind of thing works well and plays well with India because India would not find it easy to sell to a very nationalist and independent-minded Indian public that it needs another country to intervene to help it out of a scrape. In fact, from an opposition MP's point of view, let me say Mr. Modi got a lot more credit for the peaceful resolution of that crisis than arguably he deserved from what we now know about the US involvement in diffusing it. But be that as it may, that's very different from Mr. Trump saying, I'll mediate, and the vision of, say, a white American negotiator sitting at a table with an Indian and a Pakistan on either side. That brings back memories of colonialism that would be absolutely impossible for anyone to swallow. In fact, I think the West has to realize how much of an emotional scar that experience of sort of the white man telling us what was good for us has left behind. And I can assure you that it would be very, very problematic for such an offer to be made to a country that still hasn't completely got rid of the chip on the shoulder about the 200 years of somebody else ruling us. So that's something that you have to bear in mind. But having said that, yes, I mean, obviously, the Pakistani relationship is bad enough without turning it into a shooting war. And we know that on the last two occasions, this one that you just mentioned, and the 1999 Kargil episode, the US played a very constructive role, essentially vis-a-vis the Pakistanis. In both cases, the long history of very good relations that the US has built up with the Pakistani military, generations of Pakistani officers trained in and by the US, a dependence on American equipment, very good connections with the Pentagon. All of that could be used by the Americans very effectively. On the one occasion, the Clinton administration, the more recent occasion, the Trump administration, were used effectively to get the Pakistanis to make the necessary gesture to defuse the crisis. But when you ask about China, the US doesn't have that kind of relationship with China. If there were tensions with China that were about to explode into war, I don't see America being actually able to do anything other than to actually offer India military support, which it may or may not do. Because, you know, America's interest in the Indo-Pacific has largely been on the South China Sea, whereas what we're talking about with India is a land border with China. And in James Baker's famous phrase, America could well say, we don't have a dog in that fight. Nor do you have a history of the kind of influence on China that you have in Pakistan. So I don't really see America being able to defuse border tensions with China. But India has an even bigger worry, James, and that is a two-pronged problem, where the Chinese decide, in their famous or notorious phrase of 1962 vis-a-vis India then, and 1979 vis-a-vis Vietnam, to teach the other side a lesson. If they decide that they're going to teach us a lesson by marching forward, and this time the Pakistanis say, we will take the opportunity of a distracted Indian army by marching in on the other side and settling our issues, then of course the US could play a very important role and could be asked by India to play a very important role, because obviously a two-front war with two nuclear-armed adversaries is something no country in the world has had to experience since the Second World War. And it's difficult to imagine India welcoming such a possibility, however much the Prime Minister may thump his 56-inch chest. I think, you know, he's going to not want to see a two-front war facing up on India's two major borders.
And it would be a crucial crossroads in terms of India's relationship with the West with respect to how much it can rely on the US or others as security partners in something as difficult as that. I'd hate to speculate.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely fair to say, it's entirely fair to say the US doesn't owe India anything. India hasn't signed any significant military equipment and other relationships with the US that the US would be obliged to supply. But then don't forget, back in '62 when the Chinese attacked India, John Kennedy, you know, whose administration deplored in many ways India's non-alignment, and whose administration had been very critical of India's takeover of the Portuguese colony of Goa just the previous year, that US administration under President Kennedy didn't just rush planes over to India, rushed American pilots over too in those planes, who would have gone into action against the Chinese if the Chinese hadn't suddenly and abruptly called a ceasefire and end of the war. So if the fact that India was non-aligned, had no security relations or military purchases from America, didn't prevent President Kennedy from doing that vis-a-vis China in '62, I think it's not impossible that India would hope that if it really came to the crunch, which obviously our diplomacy has to prevent it happening, but if it really came to the crunch and we were suddenly facing a serious war, that the US would put aside its legalisms about a military partnership or alliance and say, we need to help India. We can't afford to see India defeated or humiliated in a military conflict at this time. So remains to be seen. These are all imponderables, and frankly, they're things we all hope will never happen.
Exactly.
I mean, none of us in India is itching for a war, and we hope nobody in Beijing is either. And it's good that both the militaries and both the diplomatic ministries, the foreign ministries, are talking to each other. It's not as if India and China are completely estranged. They are talking to each other, but tensions have not fully dissipated yet.
Well, as promised, I think we've covered an awful lot of ground. I'm not sure we went all the way on the name topic, but we've really learned a lot, Dr. Tharoor, and I know that you have time commitments today, but everyone is enormously grateful for your time and for your insights and for your wisdom on this topic. And I wanted to offer the opportunity if you had any closing comments because I know we have to wrap up shortly.
Thank you, James. Yes, we do, I'm afraid. But I just want to say that you're right. We didn't mention soft power very much. And certainly I wrote an article for a syndicated column that appeared in 88 newspapers around the world in November 2016 that the Trump victory was going to be a bit of a blow to American soft power. And, you know, I come to it as an early denizen of the Murrow Center, as I should have said to Edward Schumacher Matos. When Phil Horton established the Murrow Center, I was a student at Fletcher, and I took courses in public diplomacy and wrote about it. And when Joe Nye came up with his brilliant theory years later of soft power, I actually connected with him to say, do you mind if I take this and apply it to India? Because I see a lot of merit in the argument that soft power is a very major asset for India in the world. And I'm proud to say that I think I've managed to bring that term of art into a lot of Indian foreign policy discourse in the course of the last 20 years. And as far as the US soft power is concerned, I really do believe that, that the US has suffered in many ways from a global perception that it's no longer the country that the world admired in, shall we say, the era of the Obama Nobel Peace Prize and all the other good things that Mr. Trump seems to have cast to the winds. An America that is more xenophobic, more Islamophobic, more suspicious of immigrants, more resentful of foreigners, more generally belligerent about the rest of the world, less respectful of multilateralism. That is not the America that the rest of the world fell in love with. So that even when foreigners, the old joke used to be, James, that whenever foreigners had a problem with American foreign policy, they'd be chanting in demonstrations outside American embassies, "Yankee, go home, but take me with you," because they were so attracted to what America offered in terms of lifestyle, in terms of culture. Those things, I think, are eroding, have eroded in the last 4 years. And America faces an opportunity to recover all of that. We didn't get to speak about that very much, but the Indo-US relationship is, I believe, of great importance. And I hope that we can resume this dialogue under Fletcher auspices in due course when we actually have an opportunity to see how many of these imponderables we've touched upon will work out once the election results are known. Chinese conduct, a new US administration. I think we should have this conversation again, and we can talk about it in a much more focused way. But thank you for some very interesting questions. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. And yes, I would look forward to engaging on that, as I know everyone on this call would. So thank you very much. Professor Schumacher.
Yes, no, I think we bring it to an end here. Thank you, James. Thank you, Shashi. This has been fantastic. We really appreciate this. And thank you, everyone in the audience. With that, good night and good morning.
Thank you.